Chelsea are mid-table, but that's not where they're supposed to be, or is it? I don't know. And that's why I'm Joe Devine. But I'm joined today by someone that probably, hopefully, does know, and that's you, Jon Mackenzie.
Hi.
How you doing, buddy? Okay?
I'm good, thanks.
Fine. Well, listen, you're going to tell me some things about Chelsea today, because of course they've changed, a lot from last season, and indeed from the season before. We're getting to see Mauricio Pochettino at work now, so that's kind of interesting for us. Premier League fans will have seen him before, but this proposition is it's 2023, you've got 100,000 players, they all play in blue. What are you going to do, you know?
Yes, well, actually, one of the things that we've seen change from Pochettino 1.0 to Pochettino 2.0 is that he's changed his shape slightly.
Oh.
So people in the past may remember him playing either a 3-4-3 shape or a 4-2-3-1 shape, looking something like this. And usually what would happen is he would be desperate to get his fullbacks quite high up the pitch. That obviously leaves your fullback areas quite exposed. And so to counter that, you would have his centre-back splitting and one of his centre midfielders sitting in the space that they opened up. And again, this allowed him then to get his forward units quite narrow because the fullbacks could run into that space. That would help with their counter-pressing. But the problem is that it still was quite exposed in certain areas. And so what he's seen through his time, both at Spurs and at PSG, is that teams will target these areas, particularly after turnovers. And it did lead to some sorts of problems.
This is just a natural part of the evolution of football over time, though, right? These weren't necessarily problems when he was doing it with Spurs originally. They've just... more teams have noticed over time that they can do that, right?
Yeah, and I think teams have got much better at being able to exploit those kind of areas as well. Teams, especially at the top level, have got the best players who are then able to actually transition really dangerously. And so, you have to think way more about being defensively solid than perhaps you did 10, 20 years ago.
Well, the Premier League is completely different from when Pochettino was here last time. So what's he doing differently to try and account for that?
So there's a couple of things that I think are kind of interesting here because actually the formation that he's played, we could put it in as a 3-4-3, which is a formation that he's used in the past, but there's actually quite a bit of fluidity. There's a few players who are kind of in between. So in this situation, actually what often ends up happening is that he ends up with a back four. But if you look at that back four, the makeup of it is quite interesting. So you've got three centre-backs traditionally, with Levi Colwill often moving over onto the left-hand side, almost as a left-back in certain phases, Malagusto on the right here. But actually in possession, you'll actually see Malagusto getting quite high, and this back four becoming a back three, everyone's shifting around. So you're getting that situational back three made up of centre-backs, which we're seeing a lot of teams do now. But we've also got Ben Chilwell here, who's also played most of his career as a left-back or a left wing-back. And that suggests that, again, you're almost ending up with the potential for a back five here as well. So I think a lot of this is to do with the fact that he is now more aware of leaving those spaces open in the wide areas.
Almost as though starting formations don't matter.
Yeah, of course. And I think what we're seeing now is that actually the way that managers are using players is primarily thinking, where are the weaknesses going to lie in my system? Where are the weaknesses going to lie in the opposition system? How do we get players into those areas to really be able to exploit them?
Okay, well, Pochettino's modernising. Cool. I'm down with that. I like it. But it hasn't particularly worked that well so far this season. They had an okay draw with Liverpool to open, but losses to Nottingham Forest and West Ham so far. Presumably are there problems with the shape, or are there other issues? I
think there's been some teething issues with the shape. So, for example, I think the really interesting axis in this shape is the relationship between Colwill and Chilwell, because as we've suggested, there's a possibility that you can get a little bit more of a back five going, Chilwell offering a little bit more defensive steel on this side. And I think what we've seen so far is there's possibilities for this relationship between Colwill and Chilwell. Stop it!
I'm sorry, Dan.
And so what we've seen, I think, so far is actually the possibility of this relationship between Colwill and Chilwell being exploited a little bit. And that happened most of all, I think, in the first game of the season against Liverpool. So I've got a few screenshots here to just show you what that actually looks like.
Oh!
This is the defensive setup. So you can see that those three centre-backs look quite central here in that back line. And then we have Chilwell here dropping in alongside them. But there's just a huge amount of space in between them. Sometimes Chilwell gets quite central. But if we move it forward, we see that actually Colwill, who usually plays as a centre-back, gets isolated in these full-back areas quite a bit. So you don't want to be isolated against Mohamed Salah anyway. But when you have this amount of space from your centre-back and your wing-back / wide forward, you're going to see yourself exploited quite a bit. So that's 17 minutes in. This is 25 minutes in. And again, we can see that Colwill has been pulled quite narrow. Salah has got a huge amount of space and there's no sign to be seen of Colwill. Same again here. Salah able to pull off the back of the back four here. We've got Reece James dropping in to make that a back four. But again, the space between Chilwell and Colwill is massive. And you would want one of those players, I think, to be back to in order to allow the centre-back to have less pressure there as well. And this is just an example of one moment when it got quite well exploited by Liverpool. Alexander-Arnold on the ball, and as you can see, we've got Salah here, we've got Colwill thinking he needs to step up. He's played as a centre-back most of his career, so his natural instinct is to step up, but Chilwell is behind Salah in the play, and actually Trent Alexander-Arnold is always going to be able to play that kind of pass because we know what he's like, and in the end, Salah gets a really easy chance. Fortunately for Chelsea, it's offside, but we saw that in the first half all the time from Liverpool, just able to exploit the gap between the two of them, and so it felt as though actually the reason why Pochettino had changed that shape hadn't really worked in that first game.
Yeah, okay, fine. So there are some individual issues with it. But a little birdie told me that the underlying numbers, you're the bird, are actually pretty good.
Yeah, the underlying numbers show up really nicely. So Chelsea are fourth for expected goals created in the Premier League.
Make a bird noise.
Tweet, tweet.
But, you know.
I don't know how to...
Like,
that's good, you like that? Yeah, the underlying numbers are really good. So Chelsea are fourth for expected goals created in the Premier League. They're the third best from expected goals conceded, so they're defending really well. They're not giving away a huge amount. They're fourth on the table for expected goal difference, which makes sense because they're doing pretty well in both metrics. But also, if you look at an expected points table, which takes all of that data and works out the likelihood of the points you would pick up from those games if you played them a huge number of times. Understat has them third in their expected points table and actually has them 4.15 points higher than the current total they have in the actual table. So the underlying numbers do suggest that they've been pretty good. So in the long run, you would expect that to sort of iron out.
Twice as worse as they should have been. I mean, that's fairly concerning, isn't it? Yeah,
well, it's worth saying at this point that this is only 4 games in, and so there's going to be a huge amount of noise. But if you actually look through the individual games, they pretty much drew in terms of the underlying expected numbers with Liverpool. They then lost to West Ham in a game where they put up more expected goals than West Ham. Now, West Ham do play in a way where they're going to try and create a few chances, but good chances. So they did still put up 1.8 expected goals, which is good. But in that game, actually, it was 1-1. Enzo Fernandez missed a penalty. If Chelsea had gone up 2-1, you expect they probably would have gone on to win that game. And then they have a couple of games which are actually very similar in terms of the underlying numbers. One of them they won 3-0 against Luton, and the other one they lost 1-0 against Nottingham Forest. So again, it suggests that there's something going on there which might suggest that in the long run they're probably going to be fine.
Okay, well, you said that's a small sample size so far. But is there any data that suggests that they aren't that good?
Yeah, there are a few worrying metrics that have popped up, and the main ones are to do with finishing. Obviously, if you don't finish your chances, then you can put up really nice expected numbers, but you won't win those games. So 2 tables in particular. One of them is the big chances missed table that Opta puts out. They're joint top of that with 11 big chances missed. Everton are the other team who are doing that at the moment. So again, Everton have a finishing problem. And if we look at shooting accuracy, Chelsea are down with finishing accuracy of around 25%, which is the 18th worst in the league right now, which is not a good sign. So there's clearly an issue with finishing, but there's another metric as well which stood out to me, which is crosses. So in the league so far, Chelsea have put up 115 crosses, which is 20 more than the next closest team in the Premier League.
That's almost as many as Man United put up in that one game against Fulham.
Yeah, that's right.
In 2014.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we know that because we were given the data, right? The manager was very clear to point that out. But I mean, when you're talking about a team who are at the top end of the table, putting a huge amount of crosses in usually suggests that there's a little bit of a lack of creativity in terms of final third production, so they're starting to swing crosses in. And when you look at the sorts of players that Chelsea have up front, none of them you would describe as being particularly good aerial finishers, so that does suggest that there is a final third problem here.
Okay, fine. Well, so we've talked about system, where the vulnerabilities might be there. Let's stay with finishing, though, but let's focus on personnel instead. Like, are there specific weaknesses here? Because we brought a lot of players in.
Yeah, I think there's the elephant in the room when it comes to Chelsea's problem.
There's an elephant in the room.
There is. You may not have noticed it, but we're going to talk about it because that's what you're supposed to do with elephants in the room.
I'm the elephant.
But the elephant in the room here is that we know that Chelsea have had this wild squad turnover. And when you have players coming in, players going out, then actually a lot of the relationships between the players on the pitch can be affected. So if you look at the screen here, we've got the starting 11 against Nottingham Forest, and there's players who have barely played this season, let alone last season as well. So
they don't know what each other look like.
Yeah, exactly.
Who do you pass the ball to?
Fortunately, they wear the same colour kit, so that does help them. But you do want to develop these relationships between players. And I know Raheem Sterling said last season he struggled because he was being moved into lots of different positions, and because there was so much turnover, he wasn't able to form those relationships of knowing how players are going to play, what their instincts are going to be, and so that's obviously impacted them as well.
Now, you're very good at forming relationships as a person. Could you give any advice to the Chelsea players about how to sort of maybe what the catalyst could be to quicker, stronger friendships, John?
Yeah, well, I think that this is mainly to do with actual on-field relationships rather than... And a lot of that comes down to knowing how a player is going to react in a certain situation. So playing maybe a pass. If you know that your striker is going to run in behind rather than drop off, then you expect to play that kind of pass when you receive the ball. Versus if the striker is going to drop off, then that's going to change the way that you're going to relate as well. So
some of them might get a bit annoyed if you don't do enough hoovering, or that's what it's that kind of thing, right?
Basically that. But there's also another issue here, and that's been injuries. So the biggest impact here, again, talking about finishing, is Christopher Nkunku. I think that Chelsea would have expected him to be the beating heart of their attack, and he's not been available, so that's set them back a little bit. They've also got Armando Broja out as well, another striker option, and so instead they've been playing with Nicholas Jackson, who has spent a lot of his time, I think, before coming to Chelsea playing in wide areas. I think he's been good so far for Chelsea leading the line, but I think he very much has the feel of a striker who likes to get in behind in order to generate dangerous chances. And some of the penalty box stuff he's had to do has led to him missing chances, what you might expect a more traditional 9 to finish. So there's clearly issues with that. But then again, we've got lots of centre backs here as well. So we've got Wesley Fofana and Badiashile as well. These are two players who were brought in to be the mainstays of Chelsea's defence. And because they're not available, we're having to see Thiago Silva still. So again, Thiago Silva, a very good centre-back, but I think Chelsea were in a situation where they wanted to start moving these players through, making them mainstays of their defence, and they haven't been able to do that as well.
Here's maybe a stupid question. Enzo Fernandez, I thought he was a 6.
Yeah, and Fernandez is an interesting one because Fernandez is one of the best players that Chelsea have. And I think when you have players who are as good technical players as he is, you're always sort of faced with the option of being able to play them in different areas. So at the beginning of the season, actually Caicedo wasn't there, obviously. So we saw Gallagher and Fernandez playing together in a pivot. Gallagher maybe dropping a little bit deeper to allow Fernandez to get further up the field. But there were certain games where we actually saw the games change. So the Liverpool game, for example, I think Chelsea were able to build up better because Fernandez dropped in to help out. Such a good technical player that actually he's going to make you better if he is available in those deeper areas. But the big question is if you're having to have him drop deep all the time, are you losing his upside from getting him further up the field, right? So now Caicedo is available. We've seen Caicedo sitting as the deeper player, Gallagher alongside him, and then we've had Fernandez in this wide area here with the ability to float into deeper areas, to do a lot of more creative link-up play. And actually, another reason why Chilwell is playing, I think, because Chilwell, as we've said, usually plays as a left-back. What we're seeing him do a lot this season now, under Pochettino, is actually pinning opposition players. So pinning, whenever I say pinning, I always mean, impacting the position of opposition players. So it may be the case that he's sitting wider to pull a fullback wider to create space to attack. But actually what we've seen him doing a lot is actually getting quite direct towards the goal and then opening space out in the half space here, because Fernandez can then drift into these areas and he's super dangerous, I think, crossing from these half space areas. So again, I think that Fernandez is being moved further down the field because he is a more dangerous technical and creative player. And as we've seen, the issue with teams like Chelsea is always going to be how do you create when teams are going to low block against you as well.
Okay, well the system is clearly suiting some individual players though.
Yeah, I think Raheem Sterling, for example, is a good example of that. So Sterling has been thriving, I think, playing as a slightly narrower forward, been able to drop in and receive balls through in the half spaces. So a lot of Chelsea's build-up has worked on getting the ball to maybe a centre-back here and then finding the pass through the lines to Sterling, who can then turn and either run towards the box or hit the byline and get the ball back across the box as well. And again, this is where the lack of personnel specialism is maybe hurting Chelsea a little bit, because we've seen Sterling often find the ball at his feet in these wide areas here. And has played dangerous balls in, and it's either Jackson or Chilwell coming onto these balls. And as we said, Jackson does seem to have a little bit of a problem in terms of finishing in crowded penalty areas. And Ben Chilwell as well is essentially a player who's played most of his career at left back. He's not the sort of player that you want as an almost wide forward coming in at the back post, and he's missed a few big chances as well. And it does raise questions about why Pochettino isn't using some of these more, I think, more exciting, creative, dangerous wide players in Mudryk, Madueke and Maatsen as well.
Some of these players beginning with M.
Yeah, lots of M's there, isn't there? I noticed that. But again, if you've got players like of this calibre coming in at the back post, maybe Chelsea don't have as many finishing issues as they've had.
Well, they certainly do have a finish issue, don't they? Capital city, Chelsea.
I don't think they've got any Finnish players. Oh, actually they do. I think their goalkeeper, is it Bergstrom? Is he Finnish?
Bergstrom. People have clicked on this YouTube video to find out the answer to the question, which I think is probably, are they better than we think they are? Are they?
I think they are better because the signs so far are quite good. They are going to have players coming back from injury. There is going to be this situation where they are going to be able to fill those personnel.
But are they a top 4 challenger, John?
Well, the numbers
I guess it's top 5 now, isn't it?
Yeah, the numbers suggest that is the case. And I think as time goes by and these players start to gel more and more, then they will start heading in the right direction. So I'd be pretty positive, to be honest, if I was a Chelsea fan. I know that there's obviously a fairly competitive top 4/5 at the moment. But I think, the numbers speak for themselves. They are putting up numbers good enough to be in that kind of conversation, albeit against some teams who are towards the bottom of the table, you'd expect. So, yeah, it could be the case that they're dropping points against some of the bigger sides, but from right now, they've done pretty much what you would expect them to do under the circumstances with a new squad, a new manager, lots of new players coming through as well.
Yeah, well, there you have it.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.